When it comes to classic Resident Evil, out of all those entries, the vibe I've always gotten is that many people feel the weakest entry is either Code Veronica or Resident Evil Zero. And it's always shocked me that RE0 has such a low reputation when it's always been one of my favorites. What is it about Resident Evil Zero that has led it to being viewed as kind of like the black sheep of classic Resident Evil? I know it changes up certain elements that some people find wasn't well executed, but was it really that bad? Well, let's see. So, I'll start off with the story. I normally don't put too much weight on stories when it comes to video games, especially Resident Evil, but I have seen this argument come up a few times and it's probably one of the few things I can fully agree on. The idea of Resident Evil is that it's to tell the story of what happened to STAR's Bravo team before the events of the first game. We know that before Alpha Team reached the mansion, things went to shit in the Arklay Mountains and Bravo Team went MIA. So to see what actually happened during that first day, that's an awesome idea. And having Rebecca Chambers star as the lead, shit, that's like a match made in heaven. This prequel story is gonna be amazing. Unfortunately, while it starts out with Bravo Team in the opening cutscene, after this one scene with Buddy popping through the window, you don't encounter any other Bravo Team members until this one scene late in the game where Rebecca runs into Enrico. And you can tell the developers were like, oh shit, yeah, this is supposed to be about Bravo Team's origin story. I guess we should include the captain a little bit. We forgot this isn't supposed to be the Billy Cohen show. Oops. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Billy as a character. In fact, he's probably my favorite male character in the Resident Evil series. There's just something about his design, and his subplot about being wrongly accused for murder was very intriguing, and to me was actually pretty well done for Resident Evil standards. I love that scene where he finally opens up and tells what happened to Rebecca, but without revealing whether he was actually involved or not. To me, that was actually very believable, because from his point of view, it doesn't matter if she knows the truth or not. He's still a fugitive with no real future. I don't know, I just found it interesting that they made him keep it ambiguous to Rebecca. But either way, what the hell does the subplot have to do with the overarching plot? Not a damn thing. As much as I'd love to see him return for a future game, I can't deny Billy Cohen kind of robbed players of a proper Bravo Team story. Again, Rebecca's a great choice, and was the perfect candidate to represent Bravo Team for the story. But that doesn't mean a damn thing if they separated her from the rest of her team for the entire story. At least in Resident Evil 1, Chris and Jill ran into other members at multiple points. But the other thing that hurt the story was definitely its crappy villain, James Marcus. King of the Leeches and opera singer. Don't think you can get much more anime than that shit. Yeah, definitely not a fan. And it's a shame too, since he had potential considering he was one of the key figures of Umbrella. Well, that's just story, and gameplay is what matters most at the end of the day. And I'm probably one of the few who's actually willing to defend some of the choices this game made when it comes to what Resident Evil did differently from the rest. So much like the other games, Resident Evil Zero is all about trying to survive as you fend off zombies and other nightmarish creatures, as you explore and solve puzzles to progress further into the game, stumbling upon the mysteries of James Marcus's training facility. The first apparent change of gameplay that you'll run into pretty quickly is that now you control both of the main characters in one playthrough. For better or worse, Rebecca and Billy are pretty much tied to the hip throughout the adventure. Sure, there are segments that separate them, and you can split them up to have them explore independently, but for the majority of the time, they're gonna be together. So, one of the series' oldest tropes was expanded on, and that's the character-specific traits. Rebecca can mix herbs together in certain chemicals, but at the cost of being extremely weak to damage. Like one zombie bite can put her in caution immediately, whereas Billy can take on a lot more punishment and he has a lot more health, and can dole it out too since I believe he has a better critical hit rate. But this comes at the cost of not being able to mix herbs, and yeah, that is probably one of the worst downsides I have ever seen. Kind of hard to view not mixing herbs as a problem when you got the one that can mix herbs beside you 95% of the fucking time. No wonder this feels like Billy Cohen's game, like fuck me. But that aside, I do enjoy this change-up. It allows you to potentially explore these areas differently than you would in other games, letting you both explore different parts of the game in whatever way you want. Like I said, either independently or together. I just wish there was an option for a proper co-op. Could it potentially break the game in half if it was possible? Sure, but I think it could have worked. Well, for the PS4 remaster at least. It also does lead to some interesting puzzles and situations. Puzzles are obvious. Now that there's two characters, you can base some of those puzzles around the two having to work together. And while it never gets too intricate, I still think it does enough all the while not feeling like it's forcing it down your throat. I also like when the game does make you split up at different points, especially when you're someone like me who likes to have these two together whenever possible. It forces you to face the evil by yourself. And when you get too dependent on having both together at once, the change-up can get pretty intimidating, especially the part where it forces you to play as Rebecca alone. If you relied on Billy for the entire venture, man, you are in for a rude awakening here. Of course though, even though when you do have both together, this game isn't a pushover due to the fact that there are two characters this time around. That means enemy balance had to be adjusted this time to compensate, in this case adding a lot more enemies at any given time. Some people think this makes Resident Evil Zero too combat and action focused, but I don't really see it that way. All things considered, maybe outside of James Marcus, this game feels very grounded when it comes to action. Sure, you're definitely fighting off a lot more enemies than you normally would, but in my opinion, I feel it adds more to the challenge. In some of the other games, Remake especially, there are plenty of times where the game game gives you the option of either fight or flight, and to a degree I enjoy the concept. Either fight and deal with them now, or save your ammo and just hope you can keep managing to avoid the enemies. The problem is, once you realize that you can damn near avoid and ignore a majority of not only the normal BOWs, but also most of the bosses, that can kill the tension in a game like this big time. Here though, it's a hell of a lot harder to avoid enemies and slip past them, and you definitely can't ignore any of the boss fights. Due to this, Resident Evil Zero is probably one of the hardest in the classic games, and to me, I find it a lot more tense knowing that I can't just easily cheese it. You got no choice but to face this threat, and while some people may not like that, I personally think it's better here, because you can still attempt to avoid some of these enemies, it's just harder to do so. And I think that's partly because of the enemy lineup this time around. Zombies once again make a return alongside the pesky crows, giant spiders, and while limited, the zombie dogs. The hunters make a return and they are just as intimidating as ever, and I'm so glad to see them back. Any game that has a hunter in it, well, you might have just boosted it up an entire point. Especially now when you have a character as weak as Rebecca is when it comes to health. In fact, this game loves its fast enemies this time around. You got these giant crickets that'll hound your legs, and later in the game, these giant frogs that can insta-kill you if they do manage to swallow one of your characters, both making you have to act quickly. But without a doubt, the most infamous enemies this time around are the Marcus Leech clones, and these little shithead monkeys called the Eliminators. The Leech clones are probably the most deadliest enemies in the games that aren't hunters. They're beefy, they can hit you at long range, and their only weakness is being fire, which is a bit of a rare commodity in this game. Definitely just let Billy handle them whenever you can. And the Eliminators, oh, fuck these things, man. Easily, and I mean easily, the most annoying and aggravating enemy throughout all of classic Resident Evil in my opinion. They're quick, they jump all over the place, constantly attacking you and can potentially stun lock you if you're not careful. And they surprisingly take a lot of bullets before they finally go down. Leech clones might be a pain in the ass to deal with, but at least it's just one, and they're intimidating because of it. These little fuckers don't actually do a lot of damage. They're just irritating because they're able to take pot shots so easily, while you're probably wasting shots. Fuck these things. So when it comes to locations and atmosphere, Resident Evil Zero doesn't disappoint. Much like Remake, this is a beautiful looking game. In fact, I'd say it's even better looking. Say what you want about pre-rendered camera angles. Hell, I've made a note it's not my favorite style of gameplay. But nobody's ever gonna tell me that these games look ugly or dated, cause the original held up pretty well back then. But now with these touch-ups for the PS4 version, its art style and atmosphere is practically timeless now. As for locations, I'd say it's kind of hit or miss. You first start out on the Ecliptic Express, and I enjoy the idea of exploring a train. It's a very unique setting for a location in this series, and they surprisingly made it pretty explorable. Only problem is, it's a very small map, and extremely linear in approach. I mean, I think it's pretty near impossible to actually get lost here. After you do get past the train section, you'll make it to the training facility. On one hand, I do enjoy the atmosphere and vibe, probably due to this game's phenomenal soundtrack, but this is just the Mansion 2.0. It might be a completely different layout, but this is very much another take on the Spencer estate, and that's kind of disappointing in a way. In fact, pretty much everything else at this point is just a rehash of the tropes we've seen before. I mean, hell, you even explore some of the sections that originally debuted in Resident Evil 2. A cool callback, but that's all it is since it's over before you know it. But I'm just delaying the most infamous part about Resident Evil Zero, and that's my opinions on getting rid of the item boxes in favor of the item drop mechanic. So for the first time in the main series, no longer were you restricted in how you approach items. If you run out of space but still want to pick up a specific item, well now you can drop something to pick it up. At first glance, that's not a bad idea. In fact, it's kind of surprising that it took Capcom that long to finally include something like that. The problem is they swapped this out for item boxes, and since there's no item boxes, many people feel that this can lead to needless backtracking, instead of just being able to store everything you find. Now, can the lack of item boxes lead to brutal backtracking for the first time player? Absolutely. Can it feel irritating knowing that you can't easily stockpile a bunch of consumables? Yup. But in my opinion, people overly exaggerate about this. Even on my first playthrough, there was only a couple times where having no item boxes screwed me over and forced me to backtrack like a good 10 minutes just to get one specific item. In this case, the hook shot. And yes, it was completely aggravating since you use the hook shot at the beginning and then don't use it again until a specific part for later on. So some people argue that if there was an item box, then this wouldn't be a problem. Well, to me, that has nothing to do with item boxes or the drop mechanic, but more to do with just not being transparent enough and letting the player know that you might need this later on. Resident Evil Zero does that a couple times actually, like the green chemical that you could easily miss if you're not careful. In fact, I'd say that's even more of a problem than the hookshot thing, because up until you get to a certain point, the game doesn't actually make it really apparent that you can actually grab chemicals from these tubes, though that's independent of the issue of the item boxes versus the drop mechanic debate. And my final stance on it is, again, yes, you might spend 5 to 10 minutes backtracking for one item, but what about all those times you had to backtrack to an item box because you couldn't just swap an item out, or had to consume an herb just to make space? I guarantee you, if you add up the amount of times you had to do that, it becomes pretty equal in terms of needless backtracking. In the end though, whatever side of the debate you fall on, I think we can all agree that these games should just do both. A little bit of freedom can go a long way to make a game a bit more polished. You know what I mean? Like either take the time and put the items in the item box, or just say screw and drop an item for another, hoping you don't need it later. Giving the player more choices is never a bad thing. So in conclusion, do I think Resident Evil 0 is one of the weakest entries in the main series? No. I don't necessarily think it's the best anymore in the classic lineup, but it still nails it in a lot of places. It's just when the couple times that it does trip over itself, it can potentially faceplant hard due to a couple of beginner traps that can potentially ruin the experience. And I think that's what sullied the reputation most about this game, which is a shame since I think it's a really good game. But as much as I may defend some of the gameplay choices, if a game doesn't nail it on the first playthrough, then that's a problem, even if you can bypass the more tedious beginner traps on repeat playthroughs. At the end of the day, a first impression can make or break a game, and that's all there is to it.